Sarah Everard's death sparked, and I quote, a national conversation about systemic misogyny, and that as a result they're genuinely shocked that a man has been commissioned to write this drama. What are your thoughts?
The fact that there wasn't a woman chosen to tell this particularly female story, it begs the question, why?
There's definitely not enough of a portrayal of female voice in these kind of dramas.
It's another controversy for the BBC and its new Director General. The kidnap, rape and murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer as she was walking home one night in South London was a private tragedy that prompted a very public reckoning about misogyny. Politicians of all parties spoke with one voice.
My heartache and that of others can be summed up in just 5 words. She was just walking home. And while the specific circumstances of Sarah's disappearance are thankfully uncommon, what has happened has reminded women everywhere of the steps that we take each day without a second thought to keep ourselves safe.
That was the then Home Secretary. We also heard from a future Prime Minister.
Sometimes a tragedy is so shocking it demands both justice and change. The Stephen Lawrence case showed the poison of structural and institutional racism. The James Bolger case made us question the nature of our society and the safety of our children. Now the awful events of the last week have lifted a veil on the epidemic of violence against women and girls. This must also be a watershed moment.
There were vigils, protests, a national inquiry and even a change to the law. Now, 5 years later, the BBC has commissioned a drama about the events surrounding the murder, vowing that the award-winning writer Jeff Pope would treat it with the utmost care, ensuring that the issues that led to her death would remain in the public consciousness for years to come. But I can reveal that the broadcaster has been sent a letter by leading female screenwriters who are furious. They say that the announcement of this particular commission brought a great deal of anger to the surface among women writers, anger that has been building for some time. Sarah Everard was killed because she was a woman. The case did not simply expose the actions of one individual. It cracked open a national conversation about systemic misogyny, about the safety of women in public spaces, about institutional failure and the silencing of women within structures meant to protect them. That conversation is not over. Given all of that, we are genuinely shocked that the BBC has commissioned a man to write it. Now, Jeff Pope has a stellar track record, most recently as the screenwriter behind the ITV drama about another rapist, John Warboys.
I was certain he drugged me. It's hard to understand why a black cab driver would put his licence at risk. You know, it feels like you're calling me a liar.
Can't give you a lift. There's another 43 positively linked.
They didn't believe anything that I said.
We do not admit any liability on the part of the police.
They shouldn't be allowed to get away with what they've done.
The letter makes clear we're not saying men cannot write about women's experiences, but we are saying that in a case this specific, this raw, and this rooted in the dynamics of power and gender, the question of who tells the story is inseparable from the story itself. Every woman writing in this industry carries with her a lifetime of lived experience of navigating misogyny in its everyday forms, from the subtle to the overt. That knowledge is not incidental to writing this story, it is the story. The letter ends by praising the BBC for sometimes getting it right. For example, commissioning Nicole Taylor to write this.
How many victims?
47. And when they went to the police, nothing was done about it.
No one bothered.
What do you think that does to a kid?
We treat them as human beings and we say we're sorry.
This entire operation stands and falls on us being able to re-engage these girls.
We've spoken exclusively to one of the women who signed the letter.
I feel like the general energy of the letter wasn't so much, you know, an attack on the BBC or saying that men can't write about women's experiences. But generally, women struggle to get commissioned over men. And I think, especially writing about stories like this in particular, which is very personal to women, you know, so many women experience fear walking home at night and stuff like that. Having a female perspective behind, you know, in the background, not just on screen, I think is really valuable.
The correspondence was originally written as an open letter, but some of the women have since said they want it to remain private. The BBC released this statement to us. The BBC Drama commissioning team has met with representatives from the group to discuss the issues raised about opportunities for women screenwriters, and we're fully committed to working together to create meaningful change across the industry. It is disappointing that a letter which was shared in confidence out of respect to the Everard family has been made public in this way. We take the responsibility and trust involved in making factual drama extremely seriously, and the focus of this drama is to raise important questions about the failings from within the Met Police which led up to Sarah Everard's horrific murder. It will be made with the utmost care, sensitivity and respect. The issue of representation and diversity in this industry goes beyond looking at an individual commission in isolation, which will always have its own unique context and complexities. The industry as a whole has more progress to make. Supporting women writers and the next generation of writing talent is something we care deeply about. We're proud to be working with so many brilliant women writers whose work on the BBC spans many genres. Well, before we came on air, we also had a statement from Jeff Pope, the man who's writing the Sarah Everard drama. He said, "With all the factual dramas I make, my first and last responsibility is to the individuals impacted and their families and friends. I approach every subject with sensitivity, respect and meticulous research. Ultimately, I'm accountable to the people closest to these stories. I would hope that their feelings are respected in this matter." Well, they've been reasonable, they're trying to be constructive, but make no mistake about it, female scriptwriters are angry. For a story that goes to the heart of being a woman and the structural misogyny that we face in society, to be written by a man has really hit hard. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Dame Caroline Dinenage, chair of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. Dame Caroline Dinenage, the letter that we're talking about points out that Sarah Everard's death sparked, and I quote, a national conversation about systemic misogyny, and that as a result they're genuinely shocked that a man has been commissioned to write this drama. What are your thoughts?
Well, I suppose I would start by saying we don't fully understand the context of this. We don't understand the process that went on at the BBC to recruit the screenwriter and what conversations have taken place with Sarah Everard's family, and I think that's really important to point out. But the fact that 400 women have signed this letter, 400 really talented screenwriters with enormous experience across a whole range of different genres, and the nature of the letter as well, the sadness, it's not angry, it's kind of sad and a little bit confused as to why something that is just such, at its very heart, you know, it's an integral female story, they wouldn't have chosen a female screenwriter to tell it.
I mean, the letter makes clear that they're not saying that a man can't write about women's experiences, but, and I just quote from the letter, they say that in a case so rooted in the dynamics of power and gender, the question of who tells the story is inseparable from the story itself. The fact that it's been signed apparently by so many female screenwriters, what does that say about the strength of feeling in your view?
Yeah, I mean, it shows the strength of feeling, the sadness, the confusion as to why a female screenwriter wasn't chosen. And I think, you know, you're absolutely right to point out that men, of course, male screenwriters can write about women's experiences. And Jeff Pope is a very experienced and a brilliant screenwriter. I'm sure he'll do a great job. But this particular story, which is so deeply rooted in misogyny and violence, it's not like that's the kind of backdrop to the story. That is the heart of the story itself, which did provoke such a kind of national conversation about the safety of women in public spaces and how we can trust those that we rely upon to keep us safe. It just feels like almost impossible in something as raw as this to separate who is the storyteller from the story itself.
I mean, Jeff Pope does have an illustrious track record, not least as a writer on the ITV drama Believe Me and also the film Philomena, both dealing with female injustice. He's also said recently, yes, I'm a man, but I'm a writer, saying this is something that needs to be addressed. But I suppose there is a broader point about opportunity, isn't there? That, female screenwriters, as the letter points out, are routinely denied the kind of opportunities that a man of the pedigree of Jeff Pope almost, I guess, takes for granted.
And there are so few female screenwriters that you can think of the top of your head that would routinely be up there in some of the really sort of big BBC and other dramas. You know, you can think of Sally Wainwright and a handful of others, but actually the fact that there are 400 women that signed this letter. There are so many talented female screenwriters out there. The fact that there wasn't a woman chosen to tell this particularly female story, it begs the question, why? And that, I think, is at the root of the confusion at the heart of this letter. You know, why there aren't that huge pool of well-known female screenwriters at the heart of the BBC that they could have chosen from to be able to do a story like this.
Why do you think it is that women do appear to be underrepresented? I mean, it's hard to get accurate figures, but in this industry in particular, they do seem to be underrepresented at the top. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. I really don't know, and I think it's a really interesting question to ask the BBC because, you know, as part of the charter, the BBC charter, there is this commitment to diversity and an opportunity, and it would be really interesting to know whether this is across the board as well. You know, we're as part of the DCMS Select Committee, which I chair, we're inquiring into the BBC charter review at the moment, so there'll be lots of opportunity to ask these kind of questions as we look at how the BBC will be formed in the years ahead.
Just finally then, the BBC have met with some of the writers who signed this letter. What would you like them to commit to now in terms of taking this forward?
Did you say that they have or they haven't met with them?
They met earlier this month, yeah. 8 of the writers on this letter.
They have met?
Yeah, they have, yeah.
Okay, it's very positive if they have had that meeting, because I think, you know, it wasn't a letter sent in anger, it was a letter sent in frustration and confusion and sadness. So I think, you know, to have those conversations in a really open and transparent way, I think is a really, really good starting point. Everyone wants the BBC to succeed, everyone wants this particular programme to be a huge success because, you know, we were all deeply touched by the story of Sarah Everard and what happened to her and the tragic fate, but also what her family have had to go through. So I think it's really important that this story gets told in a very proper and sensitive way and in lockstep with the family. But, you know, if this is given an opportunity, this letter for the BBC to have those conversations with female screenwriters, then, you know, maybe it's a good opportunity.
So, to be clear, you think the Commission should go ahead or should the BBC rethink it?
Well, the letter seems to suggest that it's too late for the Commission to be changed. And as I said at the beginning of this, you know, we don't know what conversations have happened with Sarah Everard's family. And I think that has to be the number one consideration here. You know, this is a family who've just been through the most unspeakable grief and terrible experience. So the consideration has to be given to their thoughts and their feelings on this. I wouldn't want to say anything that would cause them any distress at all. So I think we just need to move forward very carefully, but maybe use this as a learning point to look again at these kind of practices and, you know, how when stories are ultimately really, really female stories, you know, integrally female stories of misogyny and violence, then I really think that, you know, we need to look at how we can get more women telling those stories.
Dame Caroline Dinenage, thank you very much. This letter gives a real insight into the absolute fury many female screenwriters feel at the moment. One of the signatories spoke of a deep anger and disappointment. Another woman told me that there was actually a lot of fear. They felt they were being emotionally blackmailed by the BBC to stay silent. They were worried about damaging their careers. But the fact that 400 women signed this letter within 24 hours, we're told, speaks volumes about the scale of the anger here. There's a real desire not to do anything to reawaken the grief of the Everard family, and there's also a lot of respect for Jeff Pope. But we've now sent this letter to the Culture Select Committee chair. They're asking questions. So it's another controversy for the BBC and its new Director General. Well, Admiral Lord West, a former Security Minister, and Gillian Keegan, former Education Secretary, are on the sofa tonight. Gillian, it's difficult, isn't it? Do you sympathise with the sentiments expressed in the letter?
Yeah, it's quite a powerful letter and very timely. And it does seem to be a missed opportunity. I don't know how the BBC commissions something. I've never looked into that before, and I've never worked in the BBC, but it does seem to be a bit of a missed opportunity to not broaden it out. And I'm sure you know, as everybody says, the most important thing is this story is told and that the family are involved in it, because it was a story that shocked everybody in the country, but every woman in the country particularly, because, you know, if you can't trust a policeman, who can you trust? It's so fundamental.
And it was such a deeply shocking moment in our nation's history, wasn't it? I mean,
because we've all done it.
Yeah.
We've all walked at that time of night, you know, staying in the light areas, and then if you think a policeman's going to take it, we all of us would have taken the same action probably, because so normal. That's why it shocked everybody so much, and it was unbelievable how that guy even became a policeman. So there's so many questions raised. But I think the other thing is, you know, Jeff Pope, I'm sure he's brilliant, and he did do a really good job on other things. But you think
Believe Me, most recently on ITV.
Believe Me, yes, which was amazing. But you think they'd share it around a bit, because this tends to happen with talent. It all keeps going to the same one, and you know, this is the whole point of diversity, to try and unblock some of that when it starts to happen.
I mean, he has got an amazing track record, and you know, Philomena, for example, he was a co-writer on that, you know, and telling women's stories. But as Gillian says, you know, it should be possible, shouldn't it, for women to write these kind of female-centred stories?
Yes, I mean, I feel slightly the sacrificial male lamb here on this particular issue, but and generally I don't like any group saying we should write stuff because it relates to us. But I think this is slightly different. I mean, going back to when I first went in the Home Office, and I'd been at sea and been a sailor and things like that, I was absolutely appalled. I could not believe the level of misogyny. I could not believe how many women were killed by their husbands regularly, on, you know, again and again. I found it quite unbelievable. And so clearly
it's been 2 a week, you know, since I can remember.
It was
that
just,
hasn't changed.
I mean, I could not believe it. I just couldn't believe it, because I had no awareness of that then. I did that after that.
So that story of male violence, you know, it's not that men are not equipped to write that story, but for the national broadcaster with a remit to look at diversity and so on, a woman could have been found, do you think?
What I don't know is what discussions went on, you know, how it was discussed. And I must admit, I didn't realise we had 800 screenwriters. They've got to watch out for AI. That's all I can say.
400 female screenwriters, yeah.
But I mean, I think it does seem extraordinary. On the face of it, it does seem extraordinary. You would have thought, they would have thought that was something, because it was the most, as Gillian says, it was the most awful incident. I mean, it was so horrific.
Do you think the BBC should rethink this decision, Gillian?
Well, I don't know at what stage it's at, but I think they will certainly think very carefully about how they do things in future. But the underlying misogyny, which, you know, Lord West has just mentioned there, but we see it time and time again. We've seen it very recently in this rape case that's just been referred to the Supreme Court. Again and again, there is something wrong with our system that doesn't really take the voices of women seriously enough.
Yeah. Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Kaylee Jones, who's nominated for a slew of stand-up comedy awards, and she is one of those who added her name to the letter. Kaylee Jones, just explain why you decided to sign the letter.
I signed the letter because I feel like the general energy of the letter wasn't so much, you know, an attack on the BBC or saying that men can't write about women's experiences, but generally women struggle to get commissioned over men. And I think, especially writing about stories like this in particular, which is very personal to women, you know, so many women experience fear walking home at night and stuff like that. Having a female perspective behind, you know, in the background, not just on screen, I think is really valuable to these kind of stories. And it sometimes feels a shame that women writers aren't approached to help tell these kind of stories.
Would you say this, because the letter reflects on quite a lot of anger within the industry, would you say that's something you've come across, that feeling?
Yeah, I mean, across the industry as a whole, there's definitely, you know, there's a struggle for women to get commissions. There is, I work mostly in comedy, you know, there is a boys' club there, and that does kind of translate across the industry as a whole. I think the people at the top that tend to produce these shows, you know, commission these shows, they tend to be middle-class men. And I think sometimes they might look at work written by women and think it's not something people want to watch, or it's, you know, it's not relatable to them. They can't relate to it. And I think having more women behind the camera really helps with these kind of portrayals, I think.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how hard you've found it to get commissioned in that environment, and how, you know, how much of a struggle that's been?
Yeah, I mean, I work more on stage and in comedy, but I have written a few scripts, and the feedback you tend to get is about originality, or you know, not quite understanding the voice. I think my background, I'm also working class, so I also battle with that as well. But there's definitely not enough of a portrayal of female voice in these kind of dramas, and I think when the people commissioning these kind of shows can't relate to the female voice or perspective when in our scripts, it's much harder to get commissioned because they can't relate.
Yeah. And you said it feels like a boys' club sometimes. And, you know, for the BBC, they've got a commitment in their charter, haven't they, to represent diverse voices. So how disappointing is that to you personally?
It's very disappointing because I think, you know, they all try. You can see that, you know, they try, and there's more opportunities for women now, but it is still really difficult to get your foot in the door. Because a lot of it all works with who you know, and they all kind of help each other. And more so in the comedy, you know, you tend to be the one token female on a lineup of 5 male acts, so they stick you right in the middle. But I think with TV, it's the same. It's still really difficult. There's not enough women writing, getting commissioned. There's not enough females behind the scene or on screen. And I think the gist of that letter was more a concern just in general with telling such important female stories such as this one. Having a female voice is really valuable, because only women understand that fear of trying to get home at night. And I think Jeff will do a great job, because, you know, his work is amazing, but it would just be great to have that female perspective on something like this.
So when you think back to the murder of Sarah Everard, and there was this extraordinary national outpouring of grief and anger and concern, as you say, about everyday safety for women, just casting your mind back to that, how did you feel about that?
Really sad and really angry on a wider scale, because what happened was absolutely horrific. It happened from a person that's supposed to protect. And then the aftermath of it, I think women were treated really poorly. You know, the statement, flag down a bus if you're scared to get home, you know, if you can't get home, or if it's late at night, you know, what a ridiculous thing to say. And I think it's those kind of things that women are just constantly battling against. And I think it's that viewpoint that was the anger. I think it was just like, when we don't feel safe anywhere, and we don't quite have that support because there's not an understanding, it seems, especially from men in power, what it's like to be a woman scared, trying to get home at night, that general fear, and how we're treated. You know, comments like that just show there's not an understanding there.
And so to have this opportunity to dramatise the events around this terrible tragedy, there was an opportunity there for a woman to reflect some of those concerns you've just set out.
Yes, I think so. And I hope he does. I mean, I watched Believe Me, and I think he did a great job, actually, at highlighting the victims over the perpetrator. And I really hope, and I think he will, do that this time. But yeah, that wider kind of misogyny around it is really important to highlight. And I think a female perspective would be so important on a show like that. It could just really add so much. It would be really valuable, I think.
Kayleigh Jones, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts with us.
Thank you.
Alan and Gillian are still on the sofa. Gillian, that idea of Kayleigh there talking about being a working class woman trying to sort of bust into this boys' club, I'm sure that resonates with you.
Yeah.
What did you think about what she said?
Oh, she's absolutely right. And I remember when I was Apprenticeships and Skills Minister, and a very famous director coming to me and saying, you need to help us get the skills. And I said to him, this is the most this industry, everybody wants to work and it's super glamorous, but it's like a closed shop. And if you live in somewhere like, you know, Newcastle or whatever, you know, what are you doing to reach those areas of the country? It's literally from the same group of private schools, literally all of the talent comes from, even if it's down to producing, actors, directors, and everybody knows this. So I think they did do a lot of work. I remember working them a big apprenticeship scheme. We put a Brit school in the north. So we were really trying to funnel that talent. And there's lots and lots more happening in the north. But it is something that, if you look at it, there's very few people from those backgrounds who make it through either to the top of comedy, the top of acting, the top of any of the jobs, a myriad of roles in the industry. And the industry could do a much better job and they'd get fabulous talent.
Alan, what do you reckon?
I think there is a problem about cliques forming in certain areas. I mean, I certainly was educated in England, but also in Scotland as well. I went to primary school in England, I went to Scotland, and then I finished my education up in Scotland. So I got used to getting the good old tours, you know, the Beltonings. They made you go the right way in those days. And I found in a number of areas when I started moving up in the tree, that people behaved in a slightly different way. They were used to people they'd all been to school with. They all thought in the same way. I'm not saying there was nothing wrong. They were nice people.
That's not an old school tie you're wearing then.
No, it's not. No, I got away. I thought, I'm not going to make that mistake with Cathy. Yes, I think it is an issue. It is an issue. But I think, I mean, the world has changed. It is so much better than it was. Yeah. I mean, you go back, 30 years, it was unbelievably bad. And there have been so many changes to our social structures that these things are very difficult to catch up with.
But I'll come back to the anger in the letter that really comes across. And I was thinking about It's a Sin, the Channel 4 drama, where the writer, Russell T Davies, chose only to cast gay actors in gay roles. And that was, quite a topic of conversation at the time. Are these kind of dramas about women's stories, is that something that really, you would have expected the BBC to make a different decision, as Channel 4 did on that drama, or at least Russell T Davies did? I
think they're going to be sat there thinking, damn, why did this is a missed opportunity. Why didn't we think, how could we not really have thought a bit more broadly about this? Unless there's something that we're missing. I guess they're probably thinking this is a missed opportunity. And it does happen. And the women for calling it out is fantastic. And how well she came across. I mean, I hope everybody looking at it.
She was delightful, wasn't she?
She just needs a shot. She needs she needs somebody to give her a break. And that's all of these people are saying. Give us a break. And
but Gillian's absolutely right. I mean, it is incredible that the BBC didn't see this coming. The BBC does tend to not see things coming, doesn't it?
Well, there's so many controversies affecting the BBC at the moment. I mean, is this why? Have you got an answer to that? Why the BBC seems
when it happens in any organisation, when things start to go wrong and the crisis is there, we see it in politics at the moment. Then they lose their nerve to make decisions. They stop becoming leaders. They stopped, they're too trying to do the right thing. They almost can do nothing for trying to think about things. And therefore, leadership is about making fair decisions, tough decisions, but then making the argument and saying why you've done something. But they become, very reticent because they've made mistake after mistake, or it seems to be mistake after mistake. And that happens in organisations. And then they've got a new leader now, so hopefully, they can do the right thing, but they do seem to be better at doing the wrong thing.
Well, you mentioned politics. Lots more of that to discuss coming up. Don't go. Well, he's the most electorally successful Prime Minister in Labour history, and he doesn't seem overly impressed with the way things are going. In a highly critical 5,700-word essay, Tony Blair warned Labour is playing with fire over the UK's future and lacks a coherent plan. Avoiding a personality contest, querying the triple lock, welfare spending and net zero targets, all of this came under fire from Sir Tony. Addressing the current Labour leadership drama, he says governments which succeed don't start with a personality contest or a political question, how do we save the country from reform? They start with an idea, a project, a governing purpose, an analysis of what is wrong and a plan to put it right. The best political space from which this can be achieved is what I call the radical centre. The centre, properly defined, is where you put policy first and politics last. So you begin with the question, what is the right answer? And only once you have that do you engage in the political task of persuading people of it. Britain is in a mess precisely because in recent years it has done the opposite. The Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, has criticised Sir Tony Blair for failing to grasp the importance of inequality in politics. He spoke to The Observer and said, if you don't get how that's driving politics now, if you're not rooting your analysis in the fact that people are unable to live and that things that were taken for granted are no longer affordable, then you're not understanding what's going on. If you want to call it left-wing, that's fine by me. It's knowing where you need to take a more left solution and where you want to be pro-business. Blairism sometimes saw the market as always the answer. That's its problem. The prioritisation of universities is a significant part of the problem that has left out too many people and has impacted on the welfare system. And fellow leadership candidate Wes Streeting has weighed in tonight too, writing in The Guardian, Tony Blair's intervention across thousands of words about technology, geopolitics and political strategy, the defining issue of our age is barely confronted at all. Inequality, the economic, social and democratic fracture running through modern Britain, is treated as peripheral rather than fundamental. Well, let's have a little chat. Alan, I mean, you know, it's created a sort of civil war in Labour, hasn't it?
Well, I think there's a sort of civil war in Labour already, isn't there?
Well, he stoked it.
And I mean, the thing that I liked about what he said is he did draw attention to the fact of this complete nonsense of having a leadership struggle at the moment, which is not what this country needs. I mean, this country needs stability. Other nations look at us and think, oh, God, Britain has gone down the pan. You know, there are some things being achieved. They've done things wrong, I agree. Starmer is not the most charismatic figure, but to have a big change and change people around is absolutely stupid. And I was saying to Gillian earlier, I'm afraid I don't rate an awful lot of MPs. I think they're sort of pygmies, really, and a complete shower.
Say what you really think.
She is somewhat different because she's actually done proper jobs.
She's an ex-MP anyway.
But they are... You know, these people are mad thinking that all this change won't do anything apart from get us in a mess. And Labour, if they can't govern and govern this country, which they are doing at the moment, they have faults, but they should be allowed to do that up to the general election. If they can't govern, then in the next general election, they'll be out and they will not govern for 20 years or more.
I want to come back to you on a few of the details that you said, but Gillian, let me bring you in here. Did you agree with what Tony Blair said?
A lot of it. His analysis of the problem, I think, is right. His context setting, I think, is right. And is also his analysis of what they've done so far, which is basically taken a wrench and thrown it into the engine of growth in the country. And that's a basic part of the problem, which, unless we take that out, is not going to help with growth. But I think looking at Andy and Wes's comments, what strikes me is theirs are quite short term in terms of, if you think through, what do I have to do to fix that? They would look to do things like the two-child benefit cap or whatever. What he's talking about is much bigger structural issues that really are going to take a long time, that someone has to get on with, you know, and we have spent too long with other distractions, not getting to those fundamentals.
Except Andy Burnham's prescription is that the last 40 years have been a write-off. I mean, you know, he would say
he was a big part of some of it, right?
That's true. What do you
Well, I was going to say, it's just rubbish, actually, isn't it? It's rubbish. And it's very, you know, stepping into a party, think I can take over and I'll become Prime Minister, wonderful. You know, I'll have speaking engagements forever when I finish and I'll be driven around in a Range Rover for the rest of my life.
You think that's what motivates him?
Well, I think there's the back of one's mind that's ticking away. But actually, becoming Prime Minister by stepping in, the hard work to become a Prime Minister is actually winning a general election. And that is what Starmer did, not stepping in and arguing about this, that, and the...
Yeah, but he wouldn't win the next election, whereas Andy Burnham might well.
Well, I honestly don't think he would.
You don't think he's got a Scooby?
I really don't think he would.
No.
But I think if Starmer, what he and Streeting and all of those should do is say, where have things gone wrong in the government? Let's make sure we get all of those right. We've got 3 years to go. Let's deliver as much as we possibly can. And I think some of what Tony Blair said is probably right, but there needs to be a balance.
Get behind the captain of the ship, in your view?
Absolutely. The lack of loyalty I find mind-boggling. I know I'm a silly old sailor and an admiral, but I find the lack of loyalty quite extraordinary.
It's mutiny on the Bounty.
Absolutely.
I want to come back to the point about inequality in a second, but a little earlier I spoke to Energy Minister Martin McCluskey about Tony Blair's analysis of the government as well as energy prices. Martin McCluskey, the energy price cap is rising by 4 times the rate of inflation. It makes the Chancellor's sort of summer of fun package of help look a bit piffling, doesn't it?
Look, Cathy, this is a really unwelcome rise in the price cap. I'm not going to try and dress it up as anything other than that. But, you know, this situation that we're facing in the Middle East is obviously very volatile, very fast moving. When we announced the last price cap, when energy prices were going down on the 25th of February, we never thought by the 27th we were going to be in the situation that we were in with Iran. What I would say is 2 things. One, we're already providing support through the £150 of costs that have been removed from the energy bills, and that was because of the Chancellor's decision at the budget last year. There's also the other help over the summer that you alluded to there for reductions in VAT, targeted reductions in VAT, but also the freeze and fuel duty till the end of the year. And as the Chancellor has been really, really clear, we are standing ready to provide support at the end of the year, and she's instructed her officials to look at every contingency to make sure that we're prepared for that when it comes to the autumn and the winter, when people's gas use is obviously a lot higher than it is over the summer.
But my point is that when people are facing energy bills that are hundreds of pounds higher, you know, a few quid off a theme park ticket is going to just seem a little bit of a stunt, isn't it?
And that's why I'm saying that that's not the only support that's on offer. So you've got, just to bear in mind that we took £150 of costs out of the energy bill in November. That is still there. That £150 of costs removed is still there. We've got the warm home discount for the most vulnerable households. That's another £150 for 6 million households across the country. And then just in the last week, we've come forward with this additional support over the summer. And what I'm saying today is that we stand ready to look and provide support at the end of the year when people's gas use is obviously going to be higher than it is over the summer. We're absolutely focused on the cost of living, which is why we've laid out all of those proposals over the last few months. But it's right that we should be preparing for all contingencies and making sure that we are ready to provide support if that's necessary.
Are you ready to do what Tony Blair says and rip up Ed Miliband's net zero targets to bring down people's bills?
Look, there's a lot in Tony Blair's essay today that I would agree with, but that's not one of the things that I would agree with. The fact of the matter is, look at what's happening in Iran, look at what happened in the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022. We are very exposed in this country to volatile fossil fuels, and that's what the Clean Power mission, Clean Power by 2030, is all about. It's about getting us off of this roller coaster of fossil fuels and giving us energy that we control at prices that we control, and that's why we're absolutely focused on that, because that's how we're going to get to proper energy security, economic security and lower bills for people.
Yeah, but it's a bit jammed tomorrow, isn't it? I wonder whether you agree with what Tony Blair said on the fact that, well, he says, come to terms with the reality that China, US and India are the 3 biggest emitters. They account for more than 50% of global emissions. I mean, UK is tiny, it's less than 1%. Do you agree with that? It's a statement of fact, isn't it?
But this isn't just about a climate argument. This isn't just a climate argument. This is about energy security and it's about affordability, which is what we are absolutely focused on. But just to pick one of those countries, China's also deploying...
Just to come back on that point, you're making affordability tougher for people, aren't you, with the net zero targets? That is a reality.
But if we walk away from clean power, what we are doing is leaving people exposed to these volatile movements in fossil fuels. It would mean leaving people exposed to volatile gas. Just look at what's happening with the price cap today. In the wholesale price, the price cap on gas has gone up by 24%. On electricity, it's gone up by 4%. The biggest part of the price cap is still the wholesale price of gas, and that's why we've got to remove ourselves from that dependence on fossil fuels and make sure that we have clean power where we control the supply and we control the price. Tony Blair is obviously entitled to his opinion on this. I respect Tony Blair a lot, but on this particular proposal, I believe he's wrong, and that's why we've got to carry on focused on clean power by 2030.
Do you think he's out of touch? Do you think he doesn't understand, as Andy Burnham suggests, how unequal, there's inequality in Britain today?
Look, he's a former Prime Minister. He is entitled to stand up and make his views heard, and he does that on a regular basis, make his views heard on a wide range of issues. And like I said, there's a lot in his essay today that I would agree with, but on this point, I don't agree with him, and I think it would actually be it wouldn't be beneficial for the country to step away from our targets on clean power.
Has he ignited a civil war in Labour over all of this? Is your boss, Ed Miliband, a bit annoyed?
Look, I don't think it's useful to focus on personalities. We are focused on delivering the change that people voted for us to do in 2024. That's what the government's focused on. I don't think it's useful to have these battles of personalities. As I said, it's a useful contribution from Tony Blair in a lot of different areas where he's making a contribution to the debate, but on this one I respectfully disagree with him.
What do you agree with in his essay then?
Look, there's, what he says in there about making sure that we're focused on policy and not just on politics and on personality, that's a really important point he's making. He's also made a lot of important points in there about basically the industrial revolution that we're facing, or the third industrial revolution on AI. I think he's really right in what he says about AI and how we need to face up to that in terms of employment and growth. So there's a lot in there that I think, basically the government is already taking action on, and where I would agree with them. But like I said, there's other areas where we can respectfully disagree.
The energy bill rises because of the war in Iran. That's a war that you wanted no part in. Donald Trump says that he's not quite there yet with a deal with Iran. What would be your message to the White House about how soon this war needs to come to an end to help the British consumer?
Look, the most important thing in all of this, and the thing that's really going to make a difference in the medium term, is the Strait of Hormuz reopening, free-flowing traffic through there. That is what's going to make such a difference in the medium term. So, I'm not going to be presumptive enough to give a message to the White House, but what I would say is that the quicker that happens, the better for the British consumer and for the British economy.
Donald Trump says that no one will control the Strait of Hormuz. Do you think he's got the basis of a deal, or is he living in cloud cuckoo land?
Look, it's clear there's been diplomatic efforts on both sides, and they are progressing. And I think the most important thing for people right across the country now, and right across the world, is that we have the Strait of Hormuz reopened in order to make sure that we have the world economy properly flowing in the way that it should be. Martin
McCluskey, thank you very much. Well, Sky's political correspondent Rob Powell spoke to Green Party leader Zach Polansky a little earlier today about Tony Blair's intervention.
Well, I think it was 5,600 words too many. Tony Blair is a former Prime Minister that dragged this country into an illegal war in Iraq. And I think it's pretty grotesque to see him selling the future of our children and grandchildren down the river through the kind of climate delay tactics, talking down clean energy and the security that we need. And I just don't think this is a sensible intervention in a day where we're speaking in these extreme temperatures, to have someone who should hold a position of responsibility, or a former position of responsibility, to be speaking like this.
Gillian and Alan are on the sofa tonight. Alan, the message that is coming across from whether it's Burnham, Streeting or current Labour ministers, and Zach Polansky there as well, is that Tony Blair is simply out of touch. Do they have a point in that the inequality that is sort of entrenched in this country and has become entrenched over many decades has to be addressed in a very different way?
I don't think he's out of touch. I really don't think he's completely out of touch. And I have to say, some of the Green leaders, well, anyway, I just give up on that one, really.
Never been in touch.
I mean, he's completely out of his tree, isn't he?
But he's on a canal boat, or was anyway.
Yes, which he wasn't paying for. Anyway, that's a different issue.
He was paying for the canal boat, but not the council tax, just to be clear.
But so I think he is in touch in that sense. But there's no doubt this feeling of there is inequality. But actually, to be fair to this government, I think they have tackled that. When they went to the general election they've actually implemented a whole number of those things. Some of them are only minor things, and they've made mistakes as well. We know they have.
So why did the Greens come within touching distance of Labour in the last local election?
Well, because people like people shouting the odds, don't they? And always halfway through if you look back to the number of midterms, called it midterm elections, completely like the Americans, they don't really give that much guidance. The Lib Dems always used to surge up, didn't they? We thought, my God, we're going to have
but this is a permanent shift that Keir Starmer seems ill-equipped to deal with. That's the message coming from the people who want to challenge him for leadership.
Well, I think they're wrong, and I think challenging at the moment and doing that, as I said, is a terrible, terrible error. because it will put us in turmoil. It means we will cease delivering things. They should be saying, right, actually we have concern here about this aspect. Couldn't we adjust and do this and this? And that's what they should be doing, not saying, let's have a big battle about who's going to be in charge. Let's go for personalities. That's what they're doing, is that.
I mean, whether it's Greens or Reform, you know, the idea is that they're listening to people on the doorstep who are howling in pain at the cost of living crisis, and your party, the Conservatives, as with Labour, has not got the answers.
They've got the wrong diagnosis, though, because what they think the answer is because none of them are actually proper working class people, right? So they're saying what the answer is to give more benefits to person A, person B or person C. Actually, that's not what people want. People want to have good education for their kids, a range of opportunities and good opportunities for their kids near to where they live, and they want to be able to get on in the workplace themselves. The only way you can do that is if you have a growing economy. The only way you get that is if the private wealth-creating part of the economy is growing, and that's why he says you need to focus on ensuring you've got a pro-business agenda, because it is the only answer, and you can work out how to divvy up the money later on when you've got the luxury of growth.
And that's where Blair was correct to an extent. So, for example, things like the investment in nuclear, at long last, after all those years when people said this is rubbish, I mean, Miliband didn't like it initially. Thank goodness we're doing that. We need to invest in these sorts of things.
Well, just briefly, I want to ask you about Iran, because that's the cause of the latest cost of living crisis. You know, Donald Trump says the deal with Iran's not quite there. You know, you obviously know about all things nautical. If you were the captain of a ship that was being asked to trust to a deal that might have been struck by then, to go through the Strait of Hormuz, what would you say? Would you be trusting that or not?
Well, I'd want to make sure, first of all, that they'd sorted out any mines that might have been laid. I thought it was very interesting that the Americans destroyed a couple of vessels laying mines, and I have a feeling there are some mines laid, and you can put timers on those so they're then switched on. So I'd want to be sure of that. But
so we're a long way from reopening the Strait of Hormuz.
I think we probably are. And if you look at Trump, his face, I mean, he does look rattled, doesn't he? He does not look as sure as he's made a catastrophic error. And actually, looking at the sort of deals they might come up with, they're worse than JCPOA.
Yes.
I mean, he's got
the deal under Obama, the nuclear deal.
But again, sorry, what we haven't talked about is defence, of course. I understand why not. But, you know, all of these issues we've got as a country, if we don't get defence sorted out, we could be at war in 3 years. I mean, Putin
Which is another point that Blair made,
already.
actually.
Putin is already at war, effectively, in the Greek, because he hates us, because we led the international fight to look after Ukraine. So he's having... And, you know, if we get these wrong, then you're at war. Then all these other issues, they count as nothing, actually.
Yeah. And actually, that was another point that Blair made, that, you know, we'll end up spending more on various bits of the welfare budget than we do on defence. Well, the ongoing reaction to Sir Tony's comments will feature on our late-night programme, The Wrap, tonight from 10 p.m. Here to discuss all of today's big stories and the best of tomorrow's papers will be the former Conservative Special Advisor, Salma Shah, and the columnist and broadcaster, Steve Richards. Now, resident doctors will go on strike again for 4 days from Monday, June the 15th, the British Medical Association has announced. The BMA said further strikes will be announced for July if no progress is made. The announcement follows the union's first talks with the new Health Secretary, James Murray, on Wednesday.
Well, the offer on the table for this year is as far as we're going to go. It's 4.9% on average increase, over 7% for some of the lowest paid. And to be clear, that's on top of a 28.9% increase over the last 3 years. I think most people would see that as being a very good offer, and going any further is simply unaffordable and not realistic. When it comes to other aspects of the offer, as I made clear to the Resident Doctors Committee today, my door is open to discussing that to make sure we can do the best for resident doctors across the country.
Gillian and Alan are still with me. I mean, I feel a bit like that, you know, Brenda from Bristol, who said not another one about a general election. I mean, we've got not another strike. It's unbelievable, isn't it?
And they were all supposed to stop, obviously, when the Labour government came in. It was only because it was the Conservative government that these were all happening, and clearly that's not the case. But I do think the junior doctors are completely out of order. They're doing the wrong thing. And actually, when you think of how much effort has been made and how much we still have to go to catch up on those waiting lists. And I had a friend who was over from Liverpool recently, and she's been waiting nearly a year for a hip, and she has another 2 years to wait, and she simply cannot walk, and she can't work the same way that she was working. So it is actually having a massive impact on our ability to employ people and people to basically be employed. And it's part of the welfare problem, I'm convinced.
Well, we'll come back to that, Alan. I mean, the BMA argues that they're being paid a fifth less resident doctors than they were in 2008 once inflation is taken into account. I mean, you can't fix the NHS without well-remunerated staff, can you?
Well, I agree, but I'm always wary of these figures when people start throwing figures around, and it does seem that there'd been quite a big effort to actually make sure that the doctors were getting a reasonable remuneration. Maybe they deserve more finally, but I have to say I find it extraordinary to find that doctors are willing to strike this often. I think I've never dealt with unions and things because basically you tell people what to do and they do it. That's one of the joys in the Navy.
But they can't strike. The Navy can't strike.
And they can't strike.
Watered down the strike protections that the last government
brought in. It's rather like Wellington, isn't it, when he became Prime Minister and he said he couldn't understand. He had his first cabinet minister. He said, I gave them my instructions and then they wanted to discuss it. And it's a bit like that. But
Alan, you dodged the question that, the last government put in protections to stop people striking as much, didn't they? And this current government ripped that up. I mean, is it time to look again at that in your view?
I think it... Actually, I have to say, I think it probably is. And I mean, I go even further than that. So I'm a bit of a sort of, I get myself in real trouble.
You're a bit of a Tory,
things like the railways, for example.
Yeah.
I believe in a British Railways. I think it's fantastic. But I think you then have to have some sort of deal, in the same with the armed forces, that people can't all go on strike because they can shut everything down. And similarly, I quite like the thought of things like, I quite like Waterloo, but we can't do that. But these things, and again, though, you've got to have some control then. You can't let people hold the whole nation to ransom.
It's blackmail, and that's exactly what they're doing, and we do need to do it. And then the Employment's Right Bill, which should be renamed the Union Rights Bill, because it's all the unions that wanted it, and it really does, hamper business growth as well. All of these things they've done, they're the wrong things, and we're on a path where what's going to stop these strikes? Nothing's going to stop them.
I have to disagree.
You're going to disagree. Amazing.
James Murray's not going to stop them.
I have to disagree with Gillian on that. I mean, I think actually the right. I think it is right to work at workers' rights, and one needs to get this.
We have workers' rights, and employers are more than interested in making sure their employees are happy and confident in their job. That's what you do. Did you not think you were a good employer?
Well, I was.
Yes, and I thought I was a good employer.
You got a medal for not leaving a sinking ship.
Yes.
I was the last to go.
For 30 years, I just happened to work for good businesses which were great to their employees. I don't know, the employers have the big incentive to make sure their employees are well looked after.
There's been quite a lot of agreement on this so far, so I have to say, you must have some sympathy with the cost of living. People are cash-strapped, and resident doctors have spent years training, they're highly qualified, and, OK, they have got pay rises worth 33% over the past 4 years, including a 3.5% increase this year, the government says, but you sympathise on the cost of living.
I sympathise on the cost of living for anybody. Lots of people find life very difficult. I mean, I'm very lucky. I've got that stage of my life now where I haven't got all those pressures, with young children and things like that. So I do feel that. But I do think the doctors probably, they need to just rein back a bit. I think the damage they're causing is quite huge if they go on strike again. And I think that's unfortunate.
So I sympathise the cost of living for everybody, but in particular the people who are sat there waiting, having their operations cancelled because these doctors who are not being trained when they're on their 16 weeks worth of strike or 16th time of striking, that is the people that I feel most sorry for because they cannot work, they cannot do what they need to do to look after their family because they're dependent on the doctors who are not living up to their side of the bargain.
Just very final thought, briefly.
Well, I mean, I just hope that they actually decide not to go on strike. I mean, my wife at the moment, as we're speaking, is in a hospital, and and there's a lot of there are lots.
She's been ill for a while, hasn't she?
Yes, she has.
And they cancel something like 500,000 appointments each time they have one of these strikes. These elective, they get moved again. So that's a lot of appointments, a lot of people impacted.
Well, thank you both for those thoughts. I hope your wife has a speedy recovery. I'll leave you with the news that many of us have long suspected. People who use meaningless business jargon are often not the best at their jobs. The study by a cognitive psychologist at Cornell University found those who were more receptive to management speak scored lower on tests of analytical thinking and problem solving. Quite how they like synergising cross-collateralisation in an office or deal with growth-hacking paradigms is anyone's guess. So there's a thought shower for you to take away tonight. And the new study by cognitive psychologists found they were more receptive. That is all they could speak. That is from me. Ali Fortescue will be with you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Bye for now.